Hello. Tonight you find yourself standing at the quiet edge of a forgotten world, where two ancient rivers move with a patience that seems to slow time itself, and as the first soft light begins to touch the horizon, you gently realize that this place, calm and unassuming, will slowly reveal how something so peaceful could one day become a land shaped by conflict. You begin to notice the faint glow of dawn spreading across the sky, soft and pale like a watercolor painting that someone forgot to finish. The rivers lie still and wide before you, reflecting the early light with a quiet shimmer. The air feels cool and steady, like the calm before a very polite conversation that no one is in a hurry to start. A thin mist lingers just above the surface of the water, rising slowly as if it is stretching after a long sleep. The land around you is wide and open, its soil dark and soft beneath your feet. It feels like the earth itself is breathing gently, which is honestly more relaxing than most meditation apps trying a bit too hard. So, before you get completely comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy what we're creating here. And while you are settling in, feel free to share where you are listening from, along with your local time, because there is something quietly comforting about knowing that people from different corners of the world are drifting into the same gentle story together, probably all pretending they will stay awake until the end. Now, slowly dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan, letting the steady hum of the air fill the room, and in that gentle rhythm, we quietly step into tonight's journey together. You begin to walk along the riverbank, noticing how the water flows without urgency, carrying fine grains of silt that settle slowly along the edges. These rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, move like long, unbroken thoughts, shaping the land in ways that feel almost invisible. It is a quiet kind of work, the kind that never asks for recognition. This region is called Mesopotamia, a name that simply means the land between two rivers, and as you stand here the meaning feels less like a definition and more like a feeling. Everything seems held gently between these waters, as if the land itself is being carefully supported, like a book resting open on a pair of steady hands. The soil beneath you is rich and dark, formed over countless seasons as the rivers deposit, layer after layer of life-giving sediment. It is the kind of soil that seems almost too generous, capable of growing crops with surprising ease. You might think of it as nature's version of a very enthusiastic gardener who never really learned how to hold back. But there is a quiet unpredictability here as well, because the same rivers that nourish the land can also overflow without warning. Floods arrive not with anger, but with a kind of indifferent certainty, reshaping the landscape in a matter of days. It feels less like destruction and more like a gentle reminder that control is always temporary. The climate moves through its own slow patterns, bringing stretches of intense heat followed by moments of relief. You begin to sense how life here requires patience, a willingness to adapt rather than resist. It is not a place where you rush outcomes, which might explain why no one here seems particularly interested in inventing deadlines. As you continue, you notice small clusters of early settlements, simple homes made from mud and reeds, built close to the water's edge. These are the first communities, people who have learned to live in quiet cooperation with the rivers. Their lives feel grounded, steady, and surprisingly organized for a time without spreadsheets. Farmers move slowly across the fields, tending to crops that grow in careful rows, while herders guide animals across the open plains. Everything happens with a sense of rhythm, as if each movement has been practiced over generations. There is no rush, no visible stress, which feels slightly suspicious by modern standards. Water defines their days. It determines when they plant, when they harvest, and how they survive. The rivers are not just part of the landscape. They are part of every decision, every routine, every quiet moment. It is a relationship built on trust, though perhaps with a small amount of respectful caution. In the distance, you begin to see larger settlements rising from the flat horizon, their shapes more defined, their presence more permanent. These are the early city-states, places like Ur, Uruk, and Lagash, each existing as its own center of life, its own small world with its own quiet sense of identity. Each city is surrounded by walls, not imposing but steady, marking the space, where one community ends and another begins. Inside, temples rise gently upward, dedicated to gods who are believed to guide and protect. It feels less like authority and more like a shared understanding that someone, somewhere, is keeping an eye on things. There is no single ruler guiding all this land, and no unified system shaping every city at once. Instead, power rests gently within separate centers, each led by its own ruler and following its own quiet path. Together, they resemble a collection of unfolding stories, existing side by side, loosely connected, like conversations happening, in different rooms of the same calm, spacious house. One city, however, begins to stand out as you look closer, its size and influence slightly greater than the rest. This is Uruk, one of the earliest known cities in human history, emerging around 4000 BCE. It represents one of the first steps toward urban life, a place where humanity begins to organize itself in entirely new ways. And yet, despite these early signs of complexity, the overall feeling remains calm and unhurried. The rivers continue to flow as they always have, indifferent to the structures forming along their banks. You begin to sense that while everything appears peaceful on the surface, something deeper is slowly beginning to take shape. The water moves, gently beside you, reflecting the growing light of the day, and as you stand quietly between these two ancient rivers, you feel a subtle shift, not sudden or dramatic, but steady and inevitable. The land remains calm, but within that calm, the earliest patterns of power are beginning to form. You continue walking as the light of morning settles fully across the land, and in that steady glow, the scattered settlements you noticed before begin to reveal themselves more clearly as organized cities, each one resting within its own boundaries, like quiet islands of structure rising gently from an otherwise open and patient landscape that seems in no hurry to interrupt them. As you approach one of these cities, you notice its walls first, built from sun-dried bricks, warm in color and slightly uneven in texture, yet strong enough to define a clear edge between inside and outside. They do not feel aggressive, only protective, like a carefully placed fence that politely suggests where one space ends and another begins. Inside the walls, life unfolds with a calm sense of order, and your attention is drawn to a large temple. Rising at the center, its structure layered upward in a way that feels both grounded and aspirational. It is dedicated to a specific god, because each city here quietly believes it has its own divine guardian, which feels oddly reassuring. You begin to understand that each city is not just a place to live, but a complete world in itself, with its own identity, traditions, and rhythms. Places like Ur, Uruk, and Lagash exist side by side, each following its own path, like neighbors who wave politely but still prefer their own cooking recipes. At the heart of each city's life stands a ruler, often referred to as a king, though his role is not limited to simple leadership. He serves as both a political guide and a spiritual representative, acting as a bridge between the people and their gods, which sounds like a demanding job, especially without the benefit of a proper weekend. You notice how this system creates a sense of balance where authority is accepted not through force, but through belief and tradition. People move through their daily routines with quiet confidence, trusting that their ruler maintains harmony not just in governance, but also in the unseen relationship between the human and the divine. Beyond the temples and leadership, you begin to see the true strength of these cities in their connection to the land. Carefully designed irrigation systems stretch outward into the fields, guiding water from the rivers into channels that nourish crops. It is an early form of engineering, surprisingly effective, like an ancient version of smart home technology, without the occasional malfunction. Fields of grain sway gently under the growing sunlight, their movement slow and rhythmic, and you can almost feel the quiet satisfaction of a system that works. Food grows reliably here, and that reliability allows everything else to exist, including art, trade, and the simple luxury of not worrying constantly about survival. Another quiet but remarkable development emerges as you observe daily life more closely: the presence of writing. Small clay tablets are pressed with wedge-shaped marks, forming what is known as cuneiform script. It is one of the earliest writing systems, and it allows people to record transactions, laws, and stories, which feels like the beginning of humanity, keeping very detailed notes. These marks may seem simple at first glance, but they represent something profound, a way to preserve thoughts beyond a single moment. You might imagine it as the ancient equivalent of saving a document, though thankfully without the anxiety of forgetting to click the save button at the last second. Yet, even within this steady and thoughtful system, there are quiet limitations that reveal themselves over time. The cities depend heavily on the rivers, and while the water provides life, it also carries uncertainty. Floods can arrive unexpectedly, disrupting fields and homes, reminding everyone that stability here is always gently negotiated. At the same time, each city remains largely independent, focused on its own needs and priorities. While they trade and interact, there is no strong, unified structure connecting them all. It feels like a collection of individual voices rather than a coordinated conversation, which works well most days, but not necessarily under pressure. And you begin to notice that relationships between these cities are complex but understated. Trade routes connect them, carrying goods like grain, textiles, and raw materials, creating a quiet network of exchange. At the same time, there's a subtle sense of competition, not openly hostile, but present, like neighbors comparing whose garden looks slightly greener. This balance between cooperation and rivalry creates a dynamic environment where cities grow and adapt, but rarely merge into something larger. Each one continues to develop its own identity, its own priorities, and its own way of understanding the world, which feels both rich and slightly fragmented. Amid this evolving structure, a notable development begins to take shape in the city of Ur around 2100 BCE, when the Code of Ur-Nammu is established. It is recognized as one of the earliest surviving legal systems in human history, carefully inscribed on clay tablets, where each rule is recorded with deliberate clarity and a quiet sense of structured authority. The code outlines specific laws and corresponding consequences, addressing matters such as property, marriage, and social order with a methodical approach. Rather than relying on arbitrary decisions, it introduces a more predictable system of justice, offering a sense of balance and fairness, even though some punishments may seem surprisingly strict when viewed through a modern perspective. This code reflects a deeper desire for order, a recognition that as societies grow, they require systems to maintain balance. It is not dramatic or forceful, but steady and deliberate, like placing stones carefully to create a path that others can follow without needing constant guidance. As you move through this landscape of quiet authority, you begin to feel how everything is held together by a delicate balance of structure, belief, and environment. Nothing feels rushed, and nothing feels entirely fixed. It is a stability that exists, but only as long as the surrounding conditions remain gentle and predictable. The rivers continue to flow, the cities continue to grow, and life continues to unfold with a calm, measured rhythm. Yet, somewhere beyond this horizon, beyond the edges of these carefully maintained systems, subtle changes are beginning to gather, almost too distant to notice at first glance. And while the cities stand steady for now, their walls firm and their systems intact, you begin to sense that this quiet balance, so carefully maintained, may not remain untouched forever, because far away, beyond the familiar patterns of river and field, another kind of movement is slowly beginning to take shape. You continue your quiet journey, and as the riverlands begin to fade gently behind you, the landscape shifts almost imperceptibly into something drier, more rugged and less forgiving. The wide, fertile plains give way to rolling hills and stretches of open desert, where the wind moves freely and the earth feels firmer, as if it has learned to conserve every drop of moisture. Here, the rhythm of life feels different, not rushed, but more deliberate, shaped by scarcity rather than abundance. Water is no longer something that quietly surrounds you, but something you must seek, store, and protect. It feels a bit like trying to keep your phone battery above 10%, except there is no charger waiting nearby. The hills rise gently. In the distance, their surfaces marked by time and wind, and the ground beneath your feet carries a dusty warmth even in the early hours. Small clusters of people live here as well, though their settlements are more spread out, their lives shaped by movement and adaptation rather than rooted permanence. These are the lands beyond Mesopotamia, regions that do not benefit from the steady generosity of the great rivers. And yet, life continues here with quiet resilience. People gather where they can, forming communities that understand how to survive with less, which, in a way, gives them a different kind of strength. Among these groups, you begin to notice something subtle, a gradual gathering of people, ideas, and movement that feels more coordinated than before. These are the Akkadians, a Semitic-speaking people whose presence becomes more visible over time, not through sudden arrival, but through steady growth and quiet persistence. Their communities expand slowly, not in dramatic bursts, but through consistent effort, and as their numbers increase, so do their needs. More people require more food, more water, and more space, and the land around them, while supportive, offers only limited resources. It is a gentle pressure, but one that steadily builds. You begin to sense how this growing population creates a quiet tension, not conflict, but a need for change. The available land can only provide so much, and the cycles of nature here are less forgiving than those of the river valleys. It feels like living in a place where everything works, but only just enough. In response, these communities begin to look outward, not with urgency, but with curiosity and intention. They observe the lands beyond their immediate surroundings, considering where resources might be more reliable, where water might flow more steadily. It is not a plan formed overnight, but a thought that returns again and again. The idea of expansion begins to take shape, not as conquest, but as movement, a natural extension of growth. It feels less like an invasion and more like someone gently stretching their arms after sitting still for too long. There is no sharp boundary between staying and moving, only a gradual shift in direction. As you continue, one figure begins to emerge within this slow transformation, a leader whose presence becomes increasingly significant. His name is Sargon, later known as Sargon of Akkad, and his story, like everything here, unfolds with a quiet sense of inevitability rather than sudden drama. Sargon is often described as beginning from modest origins, possibly serving as a cupbearer in a royal court, before rising to power. His early life remains partly uncertain, which gives his story a quiet, reflective quality, as if history shares only fragments, leaving space for imagination while preserving the calm tone of his gradual ascent. As his influence grows, Sargon brings increasing structure to the Akkadian people, guiding them toward greater unity and coordination. This change does not unfold suddenly, but builds steadily over time, shaped by consistent leadership and shared purpose, much like a routine that slowly becomes more effective without ever feeling forced or rushed. Under his direction, separate groups begin to connect more closely, forming relationships that extend beyond local concerns. These connections allow for cooperation on a wider scale, creating a sense of stability that supports not only survival, but also the possibility of growth, expansion, and a broader understanding of how communities can work together. This gradual unification carries long-term significance, even if it feels quiet in the moment. By bringing different groups into a shared structure, Sargon helps create a foundation that can support larger ambitions, not through urgency or pressure, but through steady organization that allows each part to contribute to something greater, over time. Eventually, this growing structure leads to something remarkable. Around the 24th century BCE, Sargon establishes what is often considered one of the world's first empires, extending influence across a wide region. It is not defined by sudden conquest alone, but by the ability to connect and organize diverse communities under a shared system. This development does not feel abrupt as you observe it. Instead, it unfolds like a slow tide rising, gradually covering more ground without drawing too much attention to itself. It is a reminder that some of the most significant changes in history do not announce themselves loudly, but arrive quietly, one step at a time. And yet, even as this new structure takes shape, its direction becomes easier to sense. Far ahead, the lands of Mesopotamia begin to stand out with quiet clarity, defined by flowing rivers, dark, fertile soil, and long-settled cities. They seem less like distant territory and more like a place of steady promise, offering a kind of reliability rarely found elsewhere. You begin to notice a gradual shift in attention, not driven by urgency, but by quiet awareness. Thoughts, conversations, and plans slowly begin to turn toward that region between the rivers, as if guided by something unspoken. It feels less like a decision being made, and more like a shared understanding gently forming over time. The contrast between surrounding lands becomes increasingly clear. Areas shaped by scarcity and unpredictability stand in quiet opposition to the dependable abundance of Mesopotamia. This difference does not demand action, but it becomes difficult to overlook, like noticing a steady light in the distance that remains constant, no matter how often you look away. As you stand at this quiet edge between two different worlds, you feel the subtle movement of history adjusting its course. Nothing feels urgent, nothing feels forced, yet everything is slowly aligning toward a new direction. And without a single dramatic moment, the gaze of this rising power begins to turn toward the land between the rivers. You pause at the quiet edge of the riverlands, and as your gaze drifts across the open horizon, you begin to understand that this place is not only peaceful, but also quietly important, positioned in a way that draws attention without ever asking for it, like a calm center in a room where every path seems to eventually lead. The land stretches outward in all directions, gently connecting distant regions that lie beyond your view. To the north, the hills of Anatolia rise softly, while to the west, the lands of the Levant extend toward the sea, and to the east, the vast plateau of Persia unfolds. Mesopotamia rests between them all, like a quiet meeting point. You begin to sense how this location creates a natural network of movement, where People, goods, and ideas can travel with relative ease. It is not a crossroads marked by signs, but one shaped by geography itself, where paths emerge simply because it is easier to pass through than to go around. Trade flows gently through this region, carried by caravans and small groups moving steadily across the land. Metals from distant mountains, grains from fertile fields, and crafted goods from growing cities all pass through these routes. It feels less like a marketplace and more like a quiet exchange of necessities, where everyone contributes something of value. You notice how these trade routes do not rush or compete with one another, but instead weave together in a calm and steady pattern. Goods move at a pace that matches the land itself, without urgency or excess. It is a system built on patience, which might explain why no one here seems particularly stressed about delivery times. At the heart of this exchange lies the land itself, rich and dark, nourished by the slow, consistent work of the rivers. Compared to the surrounding regions, this soil offers something rare, a reliable source of food. It feels like the difference between cooking with fresh ingredients and trying to make do with whatever happens to be left in the pantry. The fields stretch outward in soft, repeating patterns, their surfaces shaped by careful irrigation and steady attention. Crops grow in abundance, supported by water that arrives regularly, even if sometimes unpredictably. There is a quiet generosity here, a sense that the land gives more than it takes, at least most of the time. You begin to understand why this region holds such quiet appeal. It is not only fertile, but dependable in a way that other landscapes struggle to match. In a world where survival often depends on uncertainty, this kind of reliability becomes something deeply valuable, almost like finding a seat with extra legroom on a long flight. Yet the appeal of Mesopotamia extends far beyond the richness of its soil, reaching into the very shape and openness of the land itself. Unlike regions sheltered by towering mountains or dense forests, this area remains widely accessible with few natural obstacles. Its broad plains stretch outward in all directions, creating a landscape that feels open, welcoming, and quietly easy to approach. This openness allows movement to occur with little resistance, enabling people, goods, and ideas to travel steadily across the region. Paths form naturally rather than being forced, and access does not require great effort or planning. It feels less like entering a guarded space and more like stepping into a wide, open room, where the absence of barriers gently invites connection and passage. This openness gives the land a sense of invitation, though it never explicitly calls for attention. It simply exists in a way that is easy to reach, easy to enter, and easy to move through. It feels less like a fortress and more like a wide, open room where the doors are always unlocked. You begin to see how this combination of fertility and accessibility creates a quiet kind of attraction. It is not dramatic or overwhelming, but steady and persistent, like a gentle melody that stays with you long after you have heard it. The land does not demand to be taken, but it is difficult to ignore. From a strategic perspective, the region offers something even more subtle. Control of this land means access to the movement between distant areas, a way to connect different parts of the world through a single, central space. It is not about dominance, but about presence, about being where paths naturally converge. Utone. Imagine how this might feel to those living beyond the riverlands, observing from afar as goods and people move through this central region. The idea of being connected to such a network becomes increasingly appealing, not as an act of ambition, but as a natural extension of growth and curiosity. At the same time, the cities within Mesopotamia continue their quiet routines, largely unaware of how their position shapes the wider world. Life remains focused on crops, trade, and local governance, with little need to consider distant perspectives. It feels like living in a place that is important without ever needing to announce it. There is a certain stillness in this balance, as if the land itself is waiting, not actively, but simply existing in a state that allows for change when it comes. Nothing feels forced or rushed. The rivers continue their steady flow, and the cities continue to grow at their own pace. And yet, as you stand there, you begin to sense that this quiet appeal does not go unnoticed forever. The combination of fertile land, open access, and central position creates a gentle pull, one that slowly draws attention from beyond the horizon, without ever needing to raise its voice. It is not a moment of decision, but a gradual realization, forming quietly in the minds of those who observe from afar. The land between the rivers offers stability, connection, and possibility, all wrapped in a calm and unassuming presence that feels almost too balanced to remain untouched. You take a slow breath, watching the light settle across the fields, and, in that quiet moment, you feel the subtle shift once again, the sense that something is beginning, not loudly or suddenly, but with the same calm persistence as the rivers themselves, moving forward without hesitation. And so, without urgency or noise, the first steps toward this land begin to form, not as a single event, but as a quiet approach, unfolding gradually, as if guided by the same steady rhythm that shapes everything. Here, and in that gentle movement, the next chapter begins. You remain by the river's edge as the day unfolds without haste, and you begin to notice a change that does not announce itself loudly, but settles in quietly, like a new habit forming over time, where small interactions begin to shift the balance ever so gently, and what once felt separate now starts to overlap in ways that are easy to miss. At first, the movement appears simple, almost ordinary, as traders from distant regions arrive more frequently, bringing goods, tools, and unfamiliar objects that carry subtle differences in design and purpose. Their presence feels natural, as trade has always been part of life here, though now it carries a slightly wider reach. You observe these exchanges taking place in open markets, where conversations unfold in a mix of languages and gestures, and where goods pass from hand to hand with a calm sense of trust. It feels less like a transaction and more like a quiet meeting of worlds, like sharing snacks with someone whose name you forgot to ask. Along with the steady movement of goods, ideas begin to travel as well, arriving quietly and without urgency. These ideas shape how people think, speak, and organize their daily routines, not through sudden change, but through gentle influence. New customs begin to appear alongside familiar habits, creating a layered way of life that feels both continuous and quietly evolving. Rather than replacing what already exists, these influences settle into daily life with a soft presence, expanding it gradually over time. Traditions remain, but they begin to carry small variations, subtle adjustments that reflect broader connections. It feels like adding a new song to a familiar playlist, where nothing is lost, yet the overall experience becomes richer and more varied. As these exchanges continue, relationships between city-states and outside groups begin to deepen. Some cities form closer ties, not through pressure, but through shared advantage. Alliances take shape slowly, built on cooperation that offers stability and access to resources, creating connections that feel practical, balanced, and quietly beneficial for all involved. These agreements feel calm and practical, shaped by shared needs rather than ambition. A city may welcome outside support in exchange for trade advantages or protection, and in doing so, it opens its gates just a little wider. It is not surrender, but a quiet adjustment, like leaving a door slightly open for fresh air. As these alliances grow, you begin to notice another subtle change. the presence of small groups of soldiers accompanying traders or officials. They do not march in formation or create a sense of alarm, but instead remain in the background, steady and observant, like security guards at an event that is mostly peaceful. Their presence does not disrupt daily life, and people continue their routines with little visible concern. Fields are tended, markets remain active, and temples continue their quiet rituals. It feels less like occupation and more like an added layer of watchfulness, one that blends into the rhythm of the city. Gradually, influence begins to take shape in less visible ways, as decisions within some cities start to reflect the interests of their new partners. Policies shift slightly, priorities adjust, and the direction of governance becomes more aligned with those beyond the riverlands, though never all at once. You begin to sense how control does not always arrive through sudden change, but through a series of small steps that accumulate over time. Each agreement, each shared decision, each moment of cooperation adds to a structure that becomes more defined with every passing season. In some cities, this influence becomes more noticeable, as leadership begins to incorporate advisors or representatives connected to these external groups. Their voices are calm, their suggestions practical, and their presence feels almost expected, like a familiar face that gradually becomes part of the daily routine. This process unfolds differently in each place, depending on local needs and relationships. Some cities embrace these changes more readily, while others move more cautiously, maintaining a careful balance between independence and cooperation. It is a quiet negotiation, one that rarely requires urgency or force. As you move through these gently shifting landscapes, you begin to notice subtle changes in the way people speak and communicate. Akkadian, the language used by the growing external groups, appears more often in markets, official settings, and daily exchanges, gradually becoming a familiar sound among conversations that once relied almost entirely on older forms of speech. This new language does not replace Sumerian all at once, but slowly blends with it over time, creating a layered way of communication that reflects both past and present. In administration and record-keeping, Akkadian becomes increasingly common, while Sumerian continues to live on, forming a shared linguistic space shaped by continuity, adaptation, and quiet cultural merging. This shift is not immediate or complete, but it becomes increasingly visible in records, trade documents, and official matters. It feels like watching a familiar phrase slowly change over time, still recognizable but carrying a new tone that reflects a broader influence, like updating your phone's language settings without fully realizing it. Despite these changes, daily life continues with its steady rhythm. Farmers still rise with the sun, traders still gather in the markets, and families still share meals in the evening. The deeper structures may be shifting, but on the surface, everything feels calm and familiar. You begin to understand how this kind of transformation can take place without drawing attention to itself. There are no sudden disruptions, no dramatic turning points, only a gradual layering of influence that becomes clear only when you step back and look at the whole picture. The cities remain standing, their walls unchanged, their temples still reaching upward, and yet something within them is slowly evolving. It is not a loss of identity, but a quiet blending, where the line between what is local and what is external becomes less distinct with each passing day. You pause once more by the flowing river, watching as the water carries small traces of everything it touches, mixing and moving forward without hesitation. It feels like a reflection of what is happening across the land, a steady merging of paths that once seemed separate. And as the light softens and the day continues its calm progression, you begin to sense that the distinction between inside and outside is no longer as clear as it once was, because in this slow and gentle process, The boundaries themselves have begun to quietly fade. You stand quietly within the city as the day moves forward without urgency, and everything appears calm at first glance. Yet beneath this steady surface, something fundamental has already shifted. It has not happened in a single moment, but through a series of quiet adjustments that have slowly settled into place, like a long-made decision finally becoming visible. There is no clear signal marking this transition, no sound or moment that separates what once was from what now exists. The temples still rise into the sky, the markets remain active, and familiar routines continue. And yet, the direction shaping these movements has gently changed, guiding everything along a slightly altered path. You begin to sense that authority has shifted, not through visible force, but through quiet reorganization. The same leaders may still stand in place, the same structures still hold their form, but their roles now connect to something larger. It feels less like replacement, and more like a subtle expansion of influence beyond the city itself. Around 2334 BCE, under the leadership of Sargon of Akkad, many city-states are gradually brought together within a broader system. This development extends beyond individual walls and traditions, linking regions into a shared structure. It is not introduced through disruption, but through steady integration that unfolds over time. This change feels like a new rhythm settling into an existing melody, one that does not interrupt what came before, but gently reshapes it. Life continues, as it always has, yet something deeper now connects each part. And as you stand there, you begin to realize that the transformation has already become the new reality. The rulers of these cities, once fully independent, now find their authority, shifting into a more limited form. They continue to exist, to govern, and to lead, but within a structure that reaches beyond them. Their roles feel less absolute, more connected to something larger, like individual notes within a wider composition. You notice how this transition does not erase what existed before, but reshapes it gently. The cities remain themselves, their identities intact, their customs continuing, yet they are now part of a broader framework that coordinates their actions. It feels less like replacement and more like reorganization, quiet and steady. The presence of this new authority is subtle but consistent. Decisions reflect a wider perspective. Communication extends further, and the sense of connection between distant places becomes more noticeable. It is as if the land itself has become more aware of its own scale, without needing to announce it. Sargon's influence gradually extends across the region, forming what many consider one of the earliest empires in human history. This expansion is not announced through dramatic proclamations, but through steady, reliable control that reaches across distant areas, connecting places that once felt separate, all achieved without the guidance of modern maps or navigational tools. You begin to sense how this emerging structure introduces a new form of stability, one that stretches beyond individual cities and local concerns. It does not replace what already exists, but builds upon it, allowing distant regions to function together in a more coordinated and quietly unified way over time. This broader system creates connections that support both organization and continuity, linking communities while preserving the routines people depend on each day. Life does not feel disrupted, but gently guided, as familiar patterns continue within a framework that now extends further, offering a sense of balance that feels both steady and thoughtfully arranged. There is no sudden interruption to life. Farmers continue their work in the fields, traders gather in the markets, and families move through their routines with the same steady pace. The change in ownership does not disrupt the rhythm of the day, which might be the most surprising part of all. Instead, the transformation feels administrative, almost quiet enough to be overlooked. Authority has shifted, but life continues, guided by habits and needs that remain unchanged. It is a reminder that some of the most significant changes in history happen without altering the surface of everyday experience. You begin to notice how communication grows more structured and steady as messages and decisions travel between cities with greater consistency. The sense of distance starts to shift, not in miles or landscapes, but in how easily places connect. What once felt scattered now feels quietly linked, like conversations flowing more smoothly between distant but familiar voices. Paths of information become more reliable, carried by messengers, traders, and officials who move with purpose across the land. News arrives with less delay, and decisions feel more coordinated, creating a subtle sense of unity. It is not something loudly announced, but something quietly experienced, like realizing a once distant place now feels unexpectedly close. At the same time, older systems remain gently in place. Traditions continue without interruption. Languages are still spoken as they always have been, and daily rituals carry on with familiar comfort. Nothing is suddenly removed or replaced, and this continuity allows the past to remain present within the unfolding structure. The new authority does not erase what came before, but settles alongside it, forming a layered reality that feels both stable and evolving. It is as if two versions of the same story are being told at once, each one adding depth to the other, without needing to compete for attention or space. This coexistence creates a sense of continuity that allows people to adapt without losing their sense of identity. Life does not require sudden change, but gradual adjustment, where familiar routines remain intact even as new structures guide them. It feels like rearranging a room carefully, keeping everything you need, but finding a slightly better way to use the space. You begin to understand that this quiet moment holds deeper meaning than it first appears. The land is no longer defined only by separate city-states, but by connections that bind them into a shared system. This shift is not dramatic or visible, but it is steady, shaping the way everything now fits together. The idea of an empire slowly becomes something lived rather than spoken. It exists in the movement of goods, the flow of information, and the quiet alignment of decisions across regions. It is not introduced with declarations, but felt through the subtle coordination that guides daily life across distances. As you pause beside the river, watching its steady, unbroken flow, you sense how this transformation has unfolded not through force, but through time and persistence. And as the day continues calmly forward, life adjusts without resistance, settling into a rhythm that feels both new and deeply familiar at once. You move gently through the city as the new order settles into place, and what you notice first is not resistance or unrest, but a quiet continuation of life, as if the people here have learned something deeply human over generations, that change rarely asks for permission, and adapting to it often feels easier than trying to hold it back. Some people choose to leave, gathering their belongings and moving toward quieter regions where familiar ways still remain untouched, at least for a time. Their departures are not hurried or dramatic, but steady and thoughtful, like choosing a different path during a long walk when the scenery ahead begins to feel unfamiliar. Others remain, not out of reluctance, but out of practicality and connection. Their homes, their fields, and their communities are here, and so they stay, allowing the changes around them to settle gradually. It feels less like acceptance and more like continuity, like continuing to read a book even as the tone of the story shifts. As you walk through the streets, you begin to hear subtle changes in the language spoken around you. Akkadian words mix with the older Sumerian phrases, creating a layered way of speaking that reflects the blending of cultures. It sounds unfamiliar at first, but soon becomes natural, like picking up a new accent without quite noticing. This shift in language is especially visible in administration and record-keeping, where Akkadian gradually becomes more prominent. Clay tablets now carry marks that reflect this evolving system, preserving decisions, trade, and laws in a form that bridges both worlds, which feels a bit like updating software while still keeping all your old files intact. People learn to navigate these changes in quiet, practical ways. They adjust how they communicate, how they conduct business, and how they understand authority. It is not a process filled with tension, but one of steady learning, like figuring out a new routine that eventually becomes second nature. The laws themselves begin to reflect a broader system that now gently connects distant places. Earlier, codes still guide daily life, but new regulations appear with quiet consistency, forming a shared framework across cities. People follow these rules not from pressure, but from the calm predictability they offer, like a steady pattern that helps everything move with less uncertainty. This growing structure does not disrupt everyday life, but supports it in subtle ways. Agreements become clearer, expectations more consistent, and interactions between communities feel smoother. It is not a rigid system, but a dependable one, allowing people to navigate their responsibilities with a quiet sense of understanding that makes daily decisions feel easier and more settled. Beyond the city walls, the fields continue their timeless rhythm, largely untouched by these changes. Farmers rise with the sun, tending crops shaped by the same rivers, the same soil, and the same cycles of nature. The land remains steady and unconcerned with shifting authority, offering a comforting reminder that some parts of life remain constant. You watch as workers move through the irrigation channels, guiding water across the fields with practiced ease. Their movements are steady, familiar, and unhurried, reflecting a rhythm that remains constant despite the changes in leadership. It feels like a quiet reminder that some parts of life continue regardless of who is in charge. In the marketplaces, activity continues with the same gentle energy as before. Traders gather, goods are exchanged, and conversations flow easily between people from different backgrounds. The presence of new influences adds variety, but not disruption, like adding a new ingredient to a well-loved recipe. You notice how people adapt not by abandoning their traditions, but by blending them with what is new. Clothing styles, tools, and even small customs begin to reflect this mixture, creating a culture that feels both familiar and evolving at the same time. It is not a replacement, but a quiet transformation. This blending becomes especially visible in spiritual life, where long-standing Sumerian beliefs continue to exist alongside growing Akkadian influences. Temples remain active, rituals are still performed with care, and people maintain their deep connection with the divine. At the same time, new interpretations quietly emerge, expanding meaning within a shared sacred space. Rather than fading away, Sumerian culture gradually intertwines with Akkadian elements, forming a combined identity that carries features of both traditions. This transformation does not happen abruptly or through force, but unfolds gently over time, shaped by daily practice, shared experiences, and the natural interaction between communities living side by side. It feels less like one culture replacing another and more like two currents meeting and continuing together. Like streams merging into a wider river, they carry their distinct origins while moving forward as one. In this quiet union, continuity is preserved, even as something broader and more connected begins to take shape. You begin to sense how this kind of adaptation is not about losing something, but about expanding what already exists. People do not forget who they are, but instead learn to include new elements within their understanding of the world, creating a sense of continuity that feels stable and reassuring. Children grow up within this blended environment, learning both languages, understanding both traditions, and moving easily between them. For them, this new reality is not a change at all, but simply the way things are, which feels like the most natural form of acceptance imaginable. As time passes, the initial sense of difference fades, replaced by a quiet familiarity. What once felt new and uncertain becomes part of the everyday, integrated into routines and expectations. It is a reminder of how quickly people can adjust when change arrives gradually and without disruption. You pause once more, watching the quiet rhythm of life unfolding around you, and you begin to realize that although structures of power have shifted, the essence of daily existence remains deeply rooted. People continue to live, work, and connect in ways that feel steady, familiar, and quietly meaningful. There is a calm continuity in these small, repeated actions, a sense that life does not depend entirely on who holds authority. Instead, it flows through habits, relationships, and shared routines, forming a foundation that remains stable even as larger systems gently change shape over time. As the sun drifts slowly across the sky, casting long and soft shadows over the land, you sense that everything has settled into a new balance. It feels just as steady as before, though shaped under a slightly different sky, where change has been absorbed without disturbing the quiet rhythm of life. You continue your quiet walk through the city, and what once felt like gradual change now settles into something more defined. Not rigid or overwhelming, but gently structured, like a pattern that has finally revealed itself after being sketched lightly over time, where each part begins to align with a broader sense of order that feels steady and quietly dependable. The presence of authority becomes gently more visible, though never overwhelming, as appointed officials begin to appear across the cities. They carry out responsibilities that connect local life to a broader system, moving with calm purpose, organizing records, guiding decisions, and maintaining order. Like quiet caretakers ensuring everything remains in its proper place. These officials do not replace local leaders but work alongside them in a cooperative and measured way. Their roles complement existing structures, creating a layered form of governance where local traditions continue, while broader oversight quietly supports coordination across regions without disrupting the natural rhythm of daily life. This balance allows independence to remain, while gently guiding it within a wider framework. It feels less like control and more like direction, offering structure without restriction, much like following a set of directions. That still leaves room for personal judgment and flexibility within the path being taken. You begin to notice how governance now follows a more consistent and steady rhythm, where decisions are shaped not only by local concerns, but also by broader considerations that reach beyond individual cities. This creates a quiet sense of connection, as distant places begin to feel like part of the same ongoing conversation rather than separate voices speaking alone. Taxes, once varied and determined locally, gradually shift into more standardized patterns that feel predictable and carefully arranged. Resources are collected and distributed with greater balance, supporting not only individual regions but the wider system as a whole. It brings a sense of quiet order, like a routine that begins to organize itself without needing constant adjustment. This structured approach allows each region to contribute to and benefit from the larger network, creating a system that feels interconnected and stable. It is surprisingly organized for its time, operating smoothly without modern tools, as if everything simply understands where it belongs, moving in a calm and steady flow that supports the whole. The process of taxation is not disruptive, but steady, integrated into daily routines in a way that feels expected rather than imposed. People understand their roles within this system, and while it may not always be convenient, it provides a sense of stability. That allows life to continue without constant uncertainty, Laws begin to mirror the broader structure now taking shape, becoming more uniform across different regions. Local customs still remain, quietly guiding daily habits, yet a shared framework slowly emerges to shape behavior and decisions. This creates a wider sense of fairness, extending beyond individual cities, like a common rulebook gently followed without needing constant reminder. You begin to notice how this consistency in law allows communities to interact with greater ease. Trade becomes smoother, agreements clearer, and misunderstandings less frequent. It is not a perfect system, yet it functions well enough to create a calm and predictable environment, where people can move through daily life with quiet confidence and a growing sense of trust. At the center of this structure, a form of administration quietly extends its reach across the land. It does not dominate the surface of daily life, but connects cities through steady communication and careful oversight. This presence feels subtle, yet dependable, like a framework holding everything together without needing to draw attention to itself. Messages move between regions with increasing regularity, carrying decisions, updates, and guidance that shape how different places respond and adapt. The flow of information becomes more organized, allowing distant cities to remain connected. In this way, distance begins to feel smaller, not physically, but through the quiet efficiency of communication that links everything together. This centralized control does not feel overwhelming, but rather supportive, like a framework that holds everything together without drawing attention to itself. It allows the system to function smoothly, even across vast distances, which is quite remarkable given the absence of modern tools or technology. You begin to understand that the Akkadian Empire stands as one of the earliest examples of centralized administration, quietly organizing and connecting diverse regions under a shared structure. It is not introduced through grand announcements, but felt through the steady consistency of daily life, where coordination and order begin to shape how distant places relate to one another. Despite this broader control, the surface of life remains calm and familiar. Farmers continue tending their fields, traders gather in busy markets, and families follow their daily routines without interruption. The structure above them has changed, yet the foundation of everyday existence remains steady, like a familiar melody played in a slightly altered arrangement. You notice how people move through this system with quiet understanding, adjusting to its rhythms without resistance. They learn its patterns, follow its expectations, and continue their lives with a sense of ease. This order provides a subtle security, allowing individuals to focus on living rather than constantly adapting to uncertainty. This new form of stability feels different from what came before, not less secure, but more connected. It extends beyond individual cities, linking distant regions into a shared experience. These connections are not always visible, but they are present, like threads woven carefully into a larger fabric that holds everything together. At times, the system feels distant, its decisions shaped far from the lives of those it influences. Yet, it continues to function with quiet reliability, offering structure without overwhelming those within it. It is not flawless, but it provides enough consistency to support both continuity and gradual growth across the land. You pause again, watching the gentle movement of people and the steady flow of the nearby river. In that moment, you sense how this structure, though still relatively new, has already become part of the landscape, blending seamlessly into daily life as if it has always belonged there. The land remains calm, the cities continue their steady activity, and the system above them guides without drawing attention to itself. It creates a balance that feels stable, though never entirely fixed, like a quiet pause that holds within it the possibility of future change. And as the day moves softly forward, you begin to feel that while this order brings connection and calm, time itself continues its gentle passage, always carrying with it the quiet potential for something new to emerge, just beyond what can currently be seen or understood. You move quietly across the land as the new order settles into something that feels almost timeless. What once appeared as change now reveals itself as lasting traces, gently embedded in the soil and in the habits of people. Like footprints that remain long after the walker has moved on, shaping the path for those who follow. The boundaries of the land have shifted, though not in ways that feel sharply defined. The territory now stretches farther than before, connecting regions that once stood apart. It feels less like expansion in a dramatic sense, and more like the slow unfolding of a map that has always existed, simply waiting to be recognized. You begin to notice how distance feels different now, not shorter in miles, but smaller in experience. Places that once felt separate are now linked through shared systems, shared rules, and shared understanding, creating a sense of continuity that stretches across the landscape like a quiet thread. Trade flows more steadily through this expanded network, moving along established routes that connect distant regions. Goods travel with greater consistency, and the exchange of materials becomes more predictable. It feels like a system that has found its rhythm, one that allows movement without urgency, like a train that somehow always arrives without anyone checking the schedule. Markets gradually become more varied, filled with items that arrive from lands far beyond the visible horizon. Metals, woven textiles, grains, and carefully crafted goods move steadily between regions, carried along established routes. Their presence brings a quiet richness to daily life, expanding what is available without disrupting the familiar rhythm people have long known. These goods do not overwhelm the existing way of life, but gently enhance it, blending into daily routines with ease. It feels like adding new colors to a familiar painting, where the original image remains clear, yet gains depth and variation, creating a more layered and quietly vibrant experience for those who move through it. You observe how this economic expansion supports a broader sense of stability, allowing communities to rely not only on their immediate surroundings, but also on connections that extend outward. It is a form of security built on relationships, one that feels both practical and quietly reassuring. At the same time, these connections bring cultural blending that becomes increasingly visible. Language, customs, and beliefs begin to merge, not replacing one another, but forming a shared space where different traditions coexist. It feels like listening to a conversation where multiple voices contribute, yet somehow create a single, understandable message. Akkadian, now widely used in administration, continues to develop alongside the older Sumerian language, which remains present in cultural and traditional contexts. Together, they shape communication in a way that reflects both continuity and gradual change, allowing people to move comfortably between different layers of expression. Rather than competing, the two languages exist in quiet partnership, each serving its own role while contributing to a shared system of understanding. It feels like two musicians playing different instruments within the same calm and steady piece, creating harmony through balance rather than replacing one another. One of the most remarkable aspects of this blending appears in writing. Akkadian adopts the cuneiform script originally developed by the Sumerians, using the same wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets. This continuity allows knowledge to flow across generations, which feels like keeping the same notebook while gradually changing the handwriting. These tablets carry records of trade, laws, and daily life, preserving moments that might otherwise fade. You can imagine them as quiet messages sent forward through time, each mark carefully placed. Each line holding meaning that extends far beyond the moment it was written, like leaving notes for a future reader who may never meet you. Religious practices also reflect this blending, as deities and rituals begin to overlap in subtle ways. The spiritual landscape becomes layered, with older beliefs continuing alongside newer interpretations. It is not a replacement, but an expansion, like adding new stories to a collection that continues to grow. You begin to sense how identity itself becomes more fluid, shaped by both past and present influences. People do not lose their roots, but they extend them, creating connections that allow them to belong to something broader. It feels less like change and more like growth, unfolding slowly over time. The land itself carries these traces, not only in its fields and cities, but in the way it is understood and experienced. What was once a collection of separate places now feels like a connected whole, shaped by movement, interaction, and shared history. Yet, even within this sense of continuity, there is a quiet awareness that nothing remains entirely fixed. Systems that feel stable today are built on conditions that can shift, sometimes slowly, sometimes unexpectedly. It is a gentle reminder that permanence is often just a moment stretched across time. You pause near the river once again, watching as the water carries fragments of earth downstream, blending them into a continuous flow. It feels like a reflection of everything you have observed, a merging of paths, ideas, and histories into something that moves forward without looking back. The traces of this era will remain, not as monuments alone, but as patterns that shape what comes next. They are subtle, embedded in the structure of life itself, influencing decisions and directions in ways that are not always immediately visible. As the light softens across the landscape, you begin to sense that although this structure has taken root deeply and widely, it is not beyond change. Even the most carefully formed systems carry within them a quiet openness to transformation, like something steady that still leaves room for gentle shifts over time. There is a calm stillness in this realization, one that does not feel unsettling, but instead feels natural and expected. It is similar to understanding that each season gradually gives way to another, not through force or disruption, but through a slow and steady transition that feels both inevitable and peaceful. In that quiet awareness, you begin to feel that while these traces of the past will continue to endure, the story itself does not pause. It moves forward gently, carried by time, unfolding at its own pace, allowing each new moment to settle softly into place without disturbing what has come before. But no structure, no matter how stable it appears, remains unchanged forever, and somewhere beyond the horizon, new conditions are slowly beginning to gather, preparing the land for another quiet shift in its long and patient history. You continue to walk beneath the same open sky, and at first everything appears unchanged, the cities still standing, the fields still stretching outward, the rivers still moving with their familiar calm. Yet beneath this steady surface you begin to sense something quieter, a subtle shift. A subtle shift that does not interrupt the rhythm of life, but gently alters its balance. The air feels slightly different, not dramatically, but enough to notice if you remain still for a moment. Seasons seem less predictable, the warmth lingering a little longer, the rains arriving with less certainty. It is not an immediate disruption, but a gradual change, like a familiar song played just slightly out of tune. Over time, this shift becomes more visible. Fields that once produced reliably begin to yield less, and the soil, though still fertile, feels more dependent on conditions that no longer arrive as consistently. It is a quiet reminder that even the most generous landscapes rely on patterns that can change. Some scholars believe that around 2200 BCE, a period of drought, may have affected this region, altering the balance that supported both agriculture and stability. It is not something you would see all at once, but something that unfolds slowly, like a glass of water gradually evaporating without anyone noticing. The rivers continue to flow, but their rhythms feel less predictable, their seasonal patterns shifting in ways that make planning more uncertain. For those who depend on them, this change requires adjustment, patience, and sometimes difficult decisions, though no one seems particularly eager to schedule a meeting about it. As resources become slightly less reliable, the broader system that connects the region begins to feel the strain. Trade still continues, but with subtle interruptions, small delays, and quiet inconsistencies that ripple outward through the network, like a conversation where responses arrive just a little too late. At the same time, groups from beyond the established boundaries begin to appear more frequently. Among them are the Gutians, people from the mountainous regions to the east, whose movements into the area add another layer of pressure. Their presence is not sudden or overwhelming, but steady and persistent. These external groups do not immediately disrupt the cities, but their arrival introduces new dynamics, new uncertainties that require attention. It is not conflict in the loud sense, but a gradual accumulation of challenges that begin to test the stability of the system. The central authority that once coordinated and connected the region now faces increasing difficulty maintaining the same level of control. Communication becomes less consistent. Decisions take longer to implement, and the sense of unity begins to soften at the edges. You begin to notice how this weakening does not happen all at once, but in small, almost invisible ways. A delayed message here, a disrupted route there, a decision that does not quite reach its intended outcome. Each moment seems minor, but together they form a pattern that becomes harder to ignore. Local leaders begin to take on more responsibility once again, responding directly to the conditions around them instead of waiting for guidance from a distant center. Their decisions become more immediate and practical, shaped by local needs, allowing them to act with flexibility as situations quietly change over time. This shift feels natural and necessary, yet it also reflects a deeper transformation in how the system operates. Coordination gradually softens, giving way to a renewed sense of independence. As regions begin to rely more on their own judgment, returning to a familiar pattern that once defined the land. Despite these changes, daily life continues with its familiar rhythm. Farmers still tend their fields, traders still gather in markets, and families continue their routines. The larger structure may be shifting, but the foundation of everyday life remains steady, like a routine that continues even when plans change. You sense how people adapt, once again, just as they have before, adjusting to new conditions without resistance. It is not about maintaining control, but about finding balance within changing circumstances, which feels like one of the quiet strengths of human nature. The Akkadian Empire, once wide and closely connected, begins to loosen its cohesion, not through a single decisive event, but through a slow accumulation of small changes. Its structure softens gradually as conditions shift over time. Many suggest that environmental changes, possibly periods of drought, played a role, though the full picture remains gently uncertain. This uncertainty does not disturb the story, but instead gives it a quiet calm, as if history itself accepts that not every detail can be fully known or explained. It feels less like a missing piece and more like a natural pause, where understanding fades softly at the edges rather than ending abruptly. You begin to sense that even the most carefully organized systems exist within larger forces that move beyond human control. Climate, land, and time follow their own rhythms, shaping outcomes in ways that cannot always be directed, reminding you that every structure, no matter how strong, rests within a wider and ever-changing world. You pause again beside the river, watching its steady, unbroken flow. And you begin to realize that while structures of power rise and fade over time, the movement of time itself never pauses. The land adjusts, people adapt, and the story continues forward, not with urgency, but with a quiet, persistent rhythm. The changes within this system do not arrive with noise or sudden disruption, but appear gently, spreading slowly across the structure. They resemble fine lines in glass that only become visible when the light shifts in a certain way, subtle at first, yet gradually influencing how everything fits, and holds together over time. These quiet fractures do not immediately break what exists, but they alter its balance, reshaping connections, and weakening certain points without drawing attention. It is a transformation that unfolds gradually, allowing life to continue while deeper shifts take place. Beneath the surface, almost unnoticed by those moving through their daily routines. As the day begins to soften into evening, you sense that the balance, which once defined this region, is gently shifting again. It is not a movement toward chaos, but toward something new, a different arrangement. That will slowly reshape the land while still carrying echoes of what came before, and, once more, without a clear beginning or a dramatic ending. The land between the rivers continues its long and patient story. One form gives way to another with quiet ease, as if change itself is simply part of the landscape. Unfolding naturally within the steady passage of time, you return, gently and without effort, to the place where your journey first began, standing once more between the two quiet rivers. The water moves with the same patient rhythm, unchanged by everything that has unfolded, as if the land itself remembers every story, yet chooses to carry them forward without ever needing to pause or look back. The light is softer now, settling across the surface of the water in long, quiet reflections. The air feels still, almost as if the world itself is preparing to rest. The rivers continue to flow beside you, steady and unhurried, like a thought that never quite ends, but simply drifts onward. You watch the water move, and within its quiet, steady motion, patterns begin to reveal themselves. What once seemed like separate events now feels connected, forming a gentle rhythm over time. Cities rise, systems take shape, structures expand, and then slowly soften again, creating a cycle that repeats with calm consistency. As you reflect, the city-states that once stood independently, each with its own identity and quiet authority, begin to feel more distant. Their presence has not disappeared, but remains woven into the land, subtle yet lasting, like traces that continue to influence what unfolds even as their original forms gradually change. You begin to understand that these city-states were never entirely separate from what followed. They were earlier expressions of a larger story, unfolding step by step over time. Each phase leads naturally into the next, forming a continuous flow where nothing is truly lost, but gently transformed into what comes after. The empire that followed, vast and connected, brought a different kind of order, one that stretched across distances and linked many places into a shared system. And yet, like everything else, it too shifted, not suddenly, but gradually, returning the land to a new version of what it had always been. You begin to understand that this movement from many to one, and then gently back again, is not a disruption, but a natural cycle. It reflects the way people organize themselves, expanding when possible, adjusting when necessary, always seeking balance, even if that balance is never permanent. Power, in all its forms, feels less solid than it once appeared. It rises, settles, and eventually fades, not as a failure, but as part of a larger pattern. It is something that exists for a time, shaping the world around it, before quietly making space for something new. And through all of this, people continue in their quiet, steady ways. They plant seeds in the soil, build shelters from what is available, speak to one another in familiar tones, and adapt to what changes around them. What they carry forward is not fixed, but shaped by experience, gently unfolding across generations. Their resilience does not appear as resistance or force, but as something softer and more fluid. It feels like water moving around obstacles without needing to push against them. finding paths that allow continuity without disruption. In this way, life continues, not by holding firmly in place but by adjusting with calm and quiet awareness. You begin to notice how culture does not disappear when structures shift, but transforms gradually over time. Language, belief, and shared practices remain present, even as they blend and evolve. These changes do not erase identity, but expand it, allowing it to hold both what has been and what is still gently emerging. It becomes clear that identity here is not something rigid or fixed, but something living and flexible. It grows as new influences arrive, shaping what people understand about themselves and the world around them. This quiet expansion allows continuity without limitation, creating a sense of belonging that adapts rather than resists. Beside you, the rivers reflect this same steady continuity. They have carried water through every shift, nourishing the land regardless of who lives upon it or how that land is organized. Their movement does not change with power or structure, and yet everything depends on their quiet, constant presence. You begin to feel that time itself is the only true constant in this place. It moves forward without hesitation, without pausing or turning back, carrying everything gently along with it. It does not rush or delay, but continues at its own pace, like a steady rhythm that requires no effort to maintain. Standing quietly, you allow this understanding to settle within you. There is a calm in realizing that nothing needs to remain fixed. Change does not demand resistance, but invites movement, like adjusting your steps to follow the slow and steady rhythm of a song that continues without end. The land around you feels at peace, not because it has remained unchanged, but because it has embraced change as part of its nature. Each layer of history rests softly upon the last, creating depth without disturbance, supporting the present while quietly holding everything that has come before. The sky above begins to deepen in color, the light fading into softer tones, and the sounds around you grow quieter, more distant, as if the world itself is slowly settling into rest. The rivers continue their movement, unchanged, untroubled, endlessly patient. You take a slow breath, and for a moment, everything feels still, even as it continues to move. The past, the present, and what is yet to come all seem to exist together in this quiet space, held gently between the flow of water and the passing of time. There is no need to follow the story any further, no need to look ahead or back. Everything that needed to unfold has already done so, and what remains is simply this calm, this steady presence, this quiet understanding that the flow continues. The water glides softly along its path, just as it did at the beginning, unchanged in its essence, even as everything around it has shifted. It carries no memory, yet it holds every moment, moving forward without effort or resistance. As you remain here, listening to the gentle, continuous flow, you begin to feel yourself growing still. Your thoughts slow, your awareness softens, and it feels as though you are being carried quietly along, moving in harmony with that same calm and steady rhythm. The rivers flow on, as they always have, as they always will, and in their steady movement, they offer a simple truth, that everything changes, everything continues, and everything finds its place within the passage of time. The script comes to a close. Thank you all for listening.